In 1866, a coal company in Alabama needed workers. The company was called Slope Number 1 of the Eureka Mining Company. The coal was deep in the ground. The work was dangerous. The tunnels were poorly ventilated, and finding free workers willing to accept the wages and conditions the company wanted to pay was proving difficult. So the company made a different arrangement. They contacted the county sheriff, they paid a fee, and the sheriff delivered them workers, men who had been arrested for offenses including vagrancy, using loud and offensive language, and not having visible means of support. Men who had no say in the arrangement, no wages, no ability to leave, and no recourse if the conditions were unsafe. The company kept records. Those records still exist. The names in them include Green Cottenham, James Thomas, Henry Knowles, men described in company logs with the same terminology that plantation ledgers had used 20 years earlier, by first name only, by physical description, by their productive output. I know these names because a journalist named Douglas Blackman spent years pulling records from Alabama county courthouses and corporate archives and matching names to outcomes. His book, Slavery by Another Name, won the Pulitzer Prize in 2009, and what he found, documented, sourced, unambiguous, is the subject of this video. The prison system that replaced slavery was not an accident, was not an overreach, and was not limited to Alabama. It was a nationwide infrastructure. Some of it is still operating. Let's go through it, piece by piece. Understanding convict leasing requires understanding that it was not one thing. It was an ecosystem of interconnected mechanisms, each reinforcing the others, that together produced a system of forced labor that operated for nearly a century after emancipation. The arrest layer. Everything began with an arrest, and the laws that enabled those arrests were designed with a specific population in mind. The vagrancy laws passed across the South in 1865 and 1866 were, on their face, neutral. They didn't say, arrest black people. They said, arrest people who cannot prove they are employed. But in the post-war South, where white people had land and economic networks and the entire apparatus of social connection, and where black people had been emancipated with nothing and had no access to land, capital, or legal protection, the vagrancy laws functioned with near-perfect racial precision. Additional laws targeted specific behaviors that were primarily associated with black economic activity. Laws against selling farm products after dark, a way of preventing black farmers from marketing their crops independently. Laws against gaming, which, as Blackman documents, were applied to black men who played cards together and almost never to white men doing the same thing. Laws defining virtually any deviation from laboring under white supervision as criminally suspicious. The result was a legal landscape in which a black man in Alabama or Mississippi or Georgia in 1880 could be arrested at virtually any time, for virtually any reason, at the discretion of any white person with a complaint. The conviction layer. Arrest was followed by a legal proceeding, but the proceedings in county courts for these cases were not trials in any meaningful sense of the word. Defendants had no right to counsel. They were not informed of their rights. Many spoke with the judge for less than 5 minutes. Conviction rates were, in the records Blackman analyzed, approximately 100%. The fines imposed were calculated with precision, large enough to be unpayable by someone who had just been arrested for not having money, small enough to be attractive to a business looking to acquire cheap labor, typically a few dollars to a few dozen dollars, at a time when a day's wages for a black farm worker might be 50 cents. The fine was then paid by a contractor, a coal company, a railroad company, a turpentine operation, a farm, who assumed responsibility for the convicted person's fine in exchange for their labor. The legal form was presented as the company helping the convicted person pay their fine. The functional reality was purchase. The labor layer. Once leased to a contractor, convicted men entered conditions that were, in documented practice, as brutal as chattel slavery, and often worse. Worse because the economic incentive that had caused slaveholders to maintain their enslaved people to some minimal degree, the protection of a capital investment, did not exist in the same way under convict leasing. A leased convict was a rented asset, not an owned one. If he died, the company contacted the county for a replacement. There was no financial loss to the company. The mortality records that Blackman and other researchers have found in these operations are staggering. John Fletcher, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who also documented convict leasing, found records from specific operations showing annual death rates of 30 to 45%. Men working in coal mines with no safety equipment. In turpentine camps in Florida, swamps where the combination of heat, chemical exposure, and hard labor produced rapid physical deterioration. On railroad construction crews working in conditions that made survival dependent on simply lasting until the contract ended. Many did not last. Blackman's methodology was to find specific names, to turn the aggregate statistics back into individual people. And this is the approach we should use here too. Green Cottenham, born in Alabama around 1886, the son of formerly enslaved people. Arrested in 1908 at age 22 on a charge of vagrancy. His fine of $38.40 was paid by Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, owned by U.S. Steel. He was sent to Slope 12 of the Pratt mines. Green Cottenham died in those mines on August 30th, 1908 of pneumonia. He had been there approximately 5 months. He was 22 years old. His death was recorded in the company's labor accounts as the expiration of a leased unit. He had a family, a mother. His parents had survived slavery and had hoped that their children would live differently. Green Cottenham's brief life and the specific mechanism of his death are documented in courthouse records and company files. Cicero Williams, arrested in Georgia, 1901, for stealing a horse. Sentenced to 12 years of hard labor and leased to a railroad company. His sentence was extended twice for insubordination, which in practice meant any failure to work at maximum speed regardless of illness or injury. He died in 1909 after 8 years of this, having never seen his family again after his arrest. James Robertson, arrested in Mississippi, 1896, on a charge of selling cotton without a receipt. This was a real law, specifically designed to prevent black farmers from selling their crops independently. He was convicted and leased to a turpentine camp in Florida. His family spent years trying to locate him, writing letters to county offices and to the camp itself. The camp's response, when it came, was to deny that anyone by that name was in their custody. He disappeared from the records entirely. These are not representative examples selected for their extremity. They are documented individuals chosen because their records survived. The researchers who found them note that they represent a fraction of the actual cases, most of which left no surviving individual documentation. Every name, every case, every company in this video is documented. The sources are in the description, including Blackman's book, the Equal Justice Initiative's research, and the academic historians who have spent careers on this subject. If you're watching and you want to push back, the documents are there for you to examine. If you're watching and you feel what I hope this video is making you feel, please subscribe, please share it, and please stay with us. There's more. Here is a dimension of this story that is almost never discussed in mainstream accounts. The specific companies that profited from convict leasing, many of which still exist. U.S. Steel, which acquired Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company in 1907, operated mines in Alabama using convict labor. U.S. Steel is one of America's oldest industrial corporations. The Southern Railway, which built significant portions of its rail network using convict labor, eventually became part of Norfolk Southern, one of the largest freight railroad operators in the United States today. Multiple turpentine and lumber operations that used convict labor in Florida, Georgia, and Mississippi generated capital that fed into broader Southern economic development. The point is not to file legal claims against these institutions. The statute of limitations on conduct from the 1880s has clearly expired. The point is to understand where the capital came from. The infrastructure of the modern American South, its rail networks, its industrial base, its agricultural development, was built in part by men who were working for nothing under threat of violence, under legal mechanisms that were designed specifically to reconstitute slavery under a different administrative name. That capital did not disappear when the practices ended. It was invested, compounded, passed on. The economic development it produced did not benefit the communities whose forced labor created it. It benefited the communities that controlled those forced laborers. This is not the distant past, speaking abstractly to the present. This is a specific, traceable transfer of wealth, from the labor of black men arrested on pretextual charges, through the hands of extractive industries, into the infrastructure of a regional economy that occurred over approximately 60 years and that left measurable traces in the economic landscape that still exists today. Federal law effectively ended convict leasing as a practice in 1941 when the Justice Department prosecuted several egregious cases of peonage under existing federal statutes, and President Franklin Roosevelt ordered the FBI to investigate debt peonage cases. By the end of World War II, the formal leasing of convict labor to private industry had largely ended. What replaced it was not justice. It was a different configuration of the same architecture. The convict leasing era was followed by the era of state-operated prison farms. Vast agricultural operations run directly by state governments using convict labor, without the intermediary of a private company. Angola Prison in Louisiana, officially the Louisiana State Penitentiary, was built on the site of a former plantation. It used prisoner labor to farm cotton. This continued until very recently. Then came the mass incarceration era. The specific policies that produced mass incarceration are documented, and their racial impact is documented. Mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, the disparity in sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, a 100-to-1 ratio established in 1986, which meant that possessing 5 grams of crack, a drug more prevalent in black communities, triggered the same mandatory minimum as possessing 500 grams of powder cocaine, a drug more prevalent in white communities, and the systematic defunding of public defense while maintaining aggressive prosecution in communities of color. The result, the United States, which had an incarceration rate of roughly 100 per 100,000 people in 1970, had an incarceration rate of over 700 per 100,000 people by 2008, the highest of any country in the world. And black men were, and remain, incarcerated at rates 5 to 6 times higher than white men. The 13th Amendment exception clause is still operative. Prison labor is still legal. The industries that use it still exist. Here is the question that this entire video is building toward. When we say slavery ended in 1865, what exactly are we saying ended? The specific institution of chattel slavery, in which black people were legally defined as property, could be bought and sold, had no legal rights, and whose children were born enslaved, that ended, legally, by constitutional amendment. What did not end? The legal mechanism for forced labor, kept alive in the amendment's own exception clause, the economic incentive to exploit black labor at the lowest possible cost, which immediately found new legal forms once the old ones were prohibited. The political infrastructure of the South, which remained controlled by many of the same families and interests after the war, reconstituted through Reconstruction's failure and the rise of Jim Crow. The social ideology of black inferiority, which found new expressions in pseudo-scientific racism and continued to influence policy, medicine, education, and law for generations. The geographical and economic disadvantage, since emancipation came with no land, no capital, no access to the institutions of economic advancement, and an immediate reconstruction of forced labor that prevented most black families from building the asset base that white families were building through the same period. These did not end in 1865, and understanding that they did not end, that the chapter transformed rather than closed, is not pessimism. It is accuracy. And accuracy is the beginning of anything real. I want to say something about why this matters beyond the historical record. When we are told that slavery ended in 1865, full stop, complete sentence, we are being given a story about America that makes it possible to treat the present as disconnected from the past. To look at the current racial wealth gap and say, slavery ended 160 years ago, what does that have to do with today? To look at incarceration disparities and say, Those are the result of individual choices, not history. The historical record makes those disconnections impossible to maintain honestly. The men who were arrested on vagrancy charges in 1880 and worked in mines until they died, their descendants did not inherit the wealth those men would have built had they been free to build it. They inherited the absence of it. The families who spent generations in debt peonage, who could never accumulate land or capital because every year's work went toward a debt that was designed never to be repaid, their descendants entered the 20th century starting from a different place than families who had been building for those same generations. Understanding this is not about guilt. It's not about blame. It's about the simplest kind of historical honesty. Causes have effects, and those effects don't evaporate on a specific calendar date. The chapter transformed in 1865. It is still being written. Here's what I'm asking you to do. Watch this video again. Not now. Later, with someone who tells you race doesn't matter anymore. With someone who says the past is the past. With someone who can't understand why the present looks the way it does. The documents are in the description. The names are there. Green Cottenham, James Robertson, Cicero Williams. This is not a story someone invented. This is what happened. Subscribe, share this, and in the next video, we go to the science. What slavery and its aftermath left in the bodies and the epigenetics of the descendants. That video will change how you understand health disparities, family patterns, and what we mean by inherited trauma. See you there. No single institution illustrates the continuity between slavery and the modern American prison system more clearly than the Louisiana State Penitentiary, known universally as Angola. Angola takes its name from the plantation that stood on the same land before the Civil War. That plantation, 18,000 acres on a bend of the Mississippi River, was one of the largest slaveholding operations in the state. Its enslaved population numbered in the hundreds. After the war, the land was purchased by a former Confederate officer named Samuel Lawrence James. He leased convicts from the state and put them to work on the same land, farming cotton and other crops. The convict laborers were housed in the same cabins that had housed enslaved people. They worked the same fields under mounted guards with weapons. The crops were harvested using the same techniques. The state eventually took direct control of the prison in the 1890s. It continued to operate as an agricultural operation, which means that for most of the 20th century, men convicted of crimes in Louisiana were growing cotton on a former slave plantation in the same geographic location, under guard, for no wages. As recently as the 2000s, Angola was still requiring prisoners to work in the fields. Footage from this period exists. The imagery is difficult to watch because the visual continuity is so direct. Men in white prison uniforms, bent in cotton fields, under mounted guards. The prison has undergone reforms in recent decades, but it still exists. It is still on the same land. Some of the oldest structures on the property date to the antebellum period, the plantation that never stopped being a plantation. That is the most honest description of what Angola has been for 160 years.